Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be back with you once again after some wonderful vacation time and some very helpful study leave time. I'm returning with especially deep appreciation and gratitude for the worship associates who've been working so extra hard all summer to offer rich services focused on sources that our tradition draws upon for wisdom, insight, and practice. This morning, Allison Rivers Sampson facilitates a wonderful service centered around the anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment that gave women who are United States citizens the right to vote. Unless there was any doubt that we must continue to work for and to protect the right to vote, here we are, 100 years later, in the midst of extraordinarily blatant and broad voter suppression efforts, going so far as to try to hobble the United States Postal Service. The prophetic persons who put their safety and their lives on the line over 100 years ago can still be a source of inspiration for us all, as are the marginalized people who've been facing discrimination over the centuries, out of sight to many of us who've had the luxury of living safer, more comfortable lives. I know that many of you were shaken by the events in Nevada City 1 week ago today, when a group of peaceful marchers in support of Black lives and well-being were attacked verbally and physically, again blatantly, in the middle of the streets by a waiting group of counter-protesters. It was a scene many people expect to see in big cities, somewhere else. Now, more of us have been given a chance to see that the danger to people of color is not far away, not somewhere else, but right here. The danger arrives in a million small interactions, day by day, not just in such obvious and visible events on occasion. It arrives in the behaviors of others, including ourselves. Last Sunday simply makes a much larger reality more visible. To the Black, Indigenous, people of color among us, our love, our care, our commitment reaches out to you. May the events of last Sunday invite all of us to open our eyes, open our hearts, strengthen our compassion and resolve. Inspired by those who came before and those who find new ways today, may we build new ways forward together and become ourselves good ancestors. I invite you to breathe, to center your awareness in your heart, and to sing your way into this morning.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building a new way. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. Hate and greed and jealousy. We are working to be free. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. We can die. Peace and freedom is our cry. We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way. Feeling stronger every day. We are building a new way.
Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Community of the Mountains. I'm Allison Rivers Sampson, your worship associate this morning. Throughout the summer, we've been looking to our UU sources of wisdom. Today, we lift up the dedication and efforts of those who accomplished the passage of the 19th Amendment. These people exemplify the second UU source of wisdom, words and deeds of prophetic persons who challenge and confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. I don't personally resonate with the language around evil, so with this source, I think of prophetic persons calling us to confront structures of oppression with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. We celebrate the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which in theory guaranteed the vote for all women who were United States citizens, including Black women. In practice, however, some local and state authorities made it impossible for Black women to vote. On the ACLU website, they explain, the history of women's suffrage in America is not nice or neat because the impact of white supremacy is broad and human nature is messy. The 19th Amendment primarily applied to white women. It did not include Indigenous women, since they weren't considered citizens until 1924. And it wasn't until 1962 that all states fully guaranteed voting rights for Indigenous people. Still, they were prevented from voting with similar tactics used against Black voters, like poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence. Federal policy barred immigrants of Asian descent from becoming U.S. citizens until 1952. As Unitarian Universalists, we celebrate successes for justice like the 19th Amendment and also look to how we might broaden that perspective to see who is really included in such freedoms. Let us also celebrate the 155th birthday of African-American suffragist Mary Church Terrell, coming up on September 23rd. Let's celebrate the lives and legacies of Sojourner Truth, abolitionist and suffragist Harriet Tubman, and Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress and to seriously run for president. Let's honor Chinese-American suffragist Mabel Ping-Hua Lee, who said in a speech titled "The Submerged Half," "For no nation can ever make real and lasting progress in civilization unless its women are following close to its men, if not actually abreast with them." Politics is an essential part of our UU faith tradition. We are voters, dissenters, hellraisers, action takers. We are people of all shades. We own our dignity to love who we love and be who we be, beyond a binary. We listen up, speak up, rise up, and sometimes won't shut up, especially when it matters. We gather together to grow and evolve. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Community of the Mountains. I'm so happy we're together this morning.
We light our chalice today in appreciation of those prophetic women and men in the past and living today, whose words and deeds challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. May the light they shine so brightly ignite our spirits, warm our hearts, and compel us each to do our part to create a world more compassionate, sustainable, and just.
In our commitment to be respectful and in right relationship with the descendants of this area's indigenous people, we place a small basket of black oak acorns on our altar every week. In so doing, we remind ourselves and acknowledge that the Nisenan people are still here among us, though nearly invisible, that we are on Nisenan land that was never ceded, and that the original tribal families have yet to recover from the near genocide of their people. As residents or visitors in Nisenan land, let us support the Nevada City Rancheria Nisenan tribe in efforts to stabilize their people, as well as in their campaign to restore federal recognition.
There's a river flowing in my soul. There's a river flowing in my soul, and it's telling me that I'm somebody. There's a river flowing in my soul.
There is one thing mightier than kings and armies, aye, than congresses and political parties, the power of an idea when its time has come to move. The time for women's suffrage has come. The woman's hour has struck. If parties prefer to postpone action longer and thus do battle with this idea, they challenge the inevitable. The idea will not perish. The party which opposes it may.
There's a river flowing in my heart. There's a river flowing in my heart, and it's telling me that I'm somebody. There's a river flowing in my
Justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul.
There's a river flowing in my mind. There's a river flowing in my mind, and it's telling me that I'm somebody. There's a river flowing in my mind.
This is not the end of their story. After many protests and long fights, women got the right to vote on August 18, 1920. However, women of color had a much harder time voting and were continuously discriminated against until 1965. Indigenous women also faced discrimination. They were not even counted as citizens until 4 years after white women got to vote. Although the ratification of the 19th Amendment was a huge win for women, we must not forget the struggles of minorities.
Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars to change the world. Harriet Tubman.
If Congress refused to listen to and grant what women ask, there is but one course left then to pursue. What is there left for women to do but become the mothers of the future government? Victoria Claflin Woodhull.
Any great change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundation of privilege. Lucretia Mott.
I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality. Alice Paul.
Each week we take time to pause out of the busyness, the fullness of our day, of our week, to pay close attention to all that is stirring most strongly in our hearts in this moment. What joys, what sorrows, what cares, what concerns, what worries stir most strongly in this moment. I invite you perhaps to follow your breathing for a moment, to let the ease of your breathing lead you toward that awareness of that space around your heart. Leads you to notice who you carry there, or what concerns or joys about your own life stir most strongly right now. I invite you into your own attentiveness, your own prayerfulness, your own thoughtfulness, listening, feeling, witnessing what stirs most strongly in you right now. Gentle music will accompany us yet for a time. If you wish, I invite you to type into the chat some piece of the joys or the sorrows that you carry this morning. Were we together in person, we would have a chance to lift stones into a bowl of water to mark all that we hold and all that we care about. In this online time, typing into the chat is one way we can give voice to our feelings and our hopes and prayers, and one way we can be witnesses to each other. Whether we use the time to stay focused in our heart or we take the time to type something into the chat, I invite you to use this time in a way that serves your compassion, your hope. I invite you to listen ever more deeply into your heart. To accompany our prayerfulness, our thoughtfulness, our attentiveness this morning, the words and the wisdom of Rebecca Parker. Even when our hearts are broken by our own failure or the failure of others, cutting into our lives, even when we have done all we can and life is still broken, there is a universal love that has never broken faith with us and never will. Whether you know that kind of universal love deeply and intimately already, that love of which Rebecca Parker speaks, or you know another kind of universal truth that holds you, cradles you, comforts you, connects you, steadies you. May you know your own broken heart, held in a love that never breaks faith with you. So may it be.
Building bridges between our divisions, I reach out to you. Will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, friends, we could make such sweet harmony. Building bridges between our divisions, I reach out to you. Will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, friends, we could make such sweet harmony. Building bridges between our divisions, I reach out to our voices. Will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, with friends, we could make such sweet harmony. Our visions, with all of our voices, such and sweet our visions. I reach out to voices, and reach out our visions, with all of our voices and all of our visions. Friends, we could make such sweet harmony.
People say, what is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has the right to sit down and feel hopeless. There is too much to do. Dorothy Day.
What becomes a crime deserving capital punishment when the tables are turned is a matter of small moment when the Negro woman is the accusing party. Ida B. Wells.
I know nothing of man's rights or woman's rights. Human rights are all I recognize. Sarah Moore Grimke.
For the wrongs that need resistance, for the right that needs assistance, for the future in the distance, give yourselves. Carrie Chapman Catt.
The world has never yet seen a truly great and virtuous nation, because in the degradation of woman, the very fountains of life are poisoned at their source. Lucretia Mott.
Working on this service, I learned so much about the suffrage movement. As a child, my first introduction to the idea was the character Mrs. Banks, from Mary Poppins. I couldn't understand why women would want to suffer and have a movement about it. Turns out that securing the vote wasn't a peaceful process. In the words of suffragist Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. Supporters of women's suffrage endured significant suffering and violence, including being arrested, jailed, assaulted, and tortured. While only a handful of names are most often associated with the movement, many have been left out of the suffrage history most of us were taught. One unsung heroine was suffragist Jessie Haver Butler. We are so lucky to have her granddaughter, local author Mila Johansen, with us to share some of Jessie's story, along with several rare photographs she collected for her book, From Cowgirl to Congress, where even more stories and over 90 rare images can be found. Welcome, Mila.
Hi, I'm here to tell you some stories about my famous suffragette grandmother that helped raise me. She was born in Pueblo, Colorado, and raised on one of the first cattle ranches in Colorado. And under some very tragic and dire circumstances, her mother died when she was 10. Most of the mothers in that valley did not live to raise their own children because they didn't have running water, toilets, all the conveniences that we are so used to today. Her mother took her to see Susan B. Anthony speak from the back of a wagon that week, right before she died. And Jessie looked up into Susan B. Anthony's face and remembered thinking to herself, I want to help women. I want to be just like Susan B. Anthony. Eventually, a wonderful teacher that Jessie met in high school helped her get into Smith College in New England back east. And her father wanted her to stay home and feed the ranch hands and to do all the housework. And the teacher said to him, she's already stressed from losing her mother, and she did lose her stepmother and her little sister and her brother. Tragedy after tragedy. And the teacher said to her father, she will be dead in a year if she doesn't get out of here. So he eventually sent her off, paid her way, gave her some money for a wardrobe, and she was off to Smith College on the train. After Smith, her first job was to help Professor Cunliffe put together the Pulitzer School of Journalism at Columbia. For some reason, she always ended up in the center of major events. Her next job was to help set the first minimum wage for women in Boston. When Boston did a thing, then the rest of the country would follow suit. So after that, they sent her down to Washington, D.C. to become the first woman lobbyist, the first official woman lobbyist. And she was sent there to set the minimum wage for the entire country from $4 a week to $8 a week, double, if you can imagine working for either one of those salaries. And her first job was she was going to have to greet and talk to a very gruff senator to get him on her side to help the minimum wage bill go through. And he was known to think that women's only job was to stay in the home and do housework and raise children. So she dressed up, went into his office, and the secretary wasn't there, so she went right into his office. And he looked at her and he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, Senator, I have come to ask you to help us get the minimum wage bill through for women." And he said, "Why aren't you home having babies?" And she had to think about this because the whole bill may have hinged on what she said next. So she said, "Well, Senator, it's customary to have a husband before having babies, and all the good men seem to be married." He laughed and he said, "Well, then I'll have to help you." So then she explained the whole bill to him and what she wanted him to do. And suddenly he looked at her again and said, "What do you do for recreation?" And she told him that she and her friends canoed every weekend up and down the Potomac. He got very excited and went on for half an hour about his boyhood exploits in Kentucky, doing swimming and canoeing and fishing. And then he said, "What's the date you want?" And they set a date together on his calendar. He came in and got the bill through for the women. It was a very big day for all women in America. And then he told her he would help her whenever she needed it to come to him, and he would help her. Believe it or not, back then in the 1910s and teens, anybody could go down the halls of Congress, find a meeting, and go in. You could even speak at them, if you can imagine, unless it was a closed session. So Jessie was going down the halls one day for her job, and she saw a huge room, and they were having a meeting, and she went in. It was the meat packers. And they were trying to take the meat packers to task because they were kind of like Chicago gangsters and would have people bring their cattle to Oklahoma cattle yards and then not pay them or pay them less. And she knew this story well because her father, as a cattleman, had sent his cattle to Oklahoma by train. And when they got there, they offered him such a low price, not the price promised, that he lost his shirt. The next year, the cattle wandered into quicksand and sunk. So he went into real estate. So she wanted to expose it, but she knew none of the newspapers would put an article in because they all ran huge meat packer ads every day. So she wrote up an article in her perfect Pulitzer School of Journalism manner that she had learned at Columbia and took it down to her friend who worked at the Christian Science Monitor. Back then, that was a very big paper and influential. And because they didn't have the ads in their paper, she could run the article. So day after day, Jessie went in, attended the meeting, brought in the article to her friend who ran it, and pretty soon everybody started noticing what was going on. And then Jessie started bringing in a whole coalition of women to sit there and watch them, which made them very nervous. And another man started printing the articles. And pretty soon President Wilson had to pay attention and make a law to stop the meat packers. She met Alice Paul, who was her same age, and she would have lunch or dinner at Alice Paul's house right across the street from the White House. Alice Paul served lunch and dinner cafeteria style to all the women who were working with her. She had a benefactor that helped pay her way, but she was also a Quaker from a very wealthy family. And she had just attended the London School of Economics and came back after meeting Emmeline Pankhurst with the militant form of suffrage and gathered a group of women. they always tried to get Jessie to join them, but she was a parliamentarian and didn't want to do the militant way. And she met Carrie Chapman Catt, who was older than both of those two young women, who had worked with Susan B. Anthony for 30 years as the young woman in her group. And when Susan B. Anthony retired, she handed the baton to Carrie Chapman Catt. So at first, Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt worked together, but pretty soon they divided, almost violently, not liking the way each of the other was going to conduct the suffrage movement. But Jessie always said, without both of them, we may not have gotten the vote as soon. We needed the militant and the parliamentarian version of it. So then Carrie Chapman Catt took Jessie with her when she spoke all along the West as a second speaker to get each state to ratify. They had 35 states ratified and they needed one more for ratification. They needed 36, and it all came down to Tennessee, a southern state. And everyone convened in Nashville, Tennessee, when the governor finally conceded on doing one more vote. Everybody came, the Liquor Coalition, the meat packers, the steel industries, all the lobbyists who didn't want women to get the vote, and Carrie Chapman Catt and her women. And they were kind of taunted while they were there. It lasted for days, and they were spit upon, and they were jeered at, and their mail was opened. But they persisted and stayed. And that last day, the vote came down to one young man, Harry Byrne. He was the youngest senator, and he, at the very end, voted for ratification. And all the men came up to him and thumped him on the back and said, "Why did you vote for it? You weren't supposed to." And he said, "Well, I got a letter from my mother." And here's what the letter said. "Dear son, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. Your mother." So, because of one humble farm woman in the hills of Tennessee, 17 million women won the right to vote. Well, the newspaper men got very excited and rented cars. They all didn't have cars. And headed for the hills to her farm. She was coming out of the milking barn with 2 pails of milk, and she invited him into the kitchen, sat him down at the table, and served some baked goods she had made that morning with the milk. And they asked her, "Why did you write that letter to your son?" She said, "Well, in the winters, they're very long here in the hills, and we're always reading Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is always funning with words, so I thought maybe I could fun with some words." And that is how 17 million women won the right to vote. Now I have a short video with a lot of the rare pictures I have found in the archives. About 2 years ago, I started going through my grandmother's archives that were sent to me decades ago. And I found her memoir and lots of rare pictures, and I thought this should be a book, so I started making it. And 2 months into it, I realized the 100th anniversary was coming up, so it was very serendipitous. And so here are some of the pictures, and I put 94 in the book, and I left a lot of them out. There's even some letters from Carrie Chapman Catt, a letter from George Bernard Shaw, all her instances with Eleanor Roosevelt, who she spoke beside later on, and pictures of her with Gloria Steinem and Marlo Thomas, who she spoke with in her early 90s and took me along.
As I headed out the door with my ballot, I was reminded of the courage of my grandmother on the front lines of the suffrage movement. I've listened to my grandmother's stories since I was a toddler. Those first tales were amazing ones about animals that lived on the Colorado ranch where she grew up. Other times, she told me about how, as a little girl, she would get herself into some mischief or another. I loved those stories best. She never got tired of telling them, and I never got tired of listening. Every story infused me with a sense of possibility. Jessie Haver Butler grew up in Pueblo, Colorado, on a large cattle ranch. Her early years were riddled with unthinkable tragedies. Jessie was 10 years old the day she looked up into the face of Susan B. Anthony, who was touring the West speaking about women's rights from the back of a wooden wagon. That was the day she found hope and purpose in her life, which was passed on to me. She knew at that moment that she would grow up to speak out for the rights of women. I am in awe of my grandmother that, against all odds, she attended Smith College and earned a degree in public speaking. She went on to become the first woman lobbyist at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., proudly carrying the torch that she had been handed by Susan B. Anthony that fateful day in Pueblo. I would have loved to be with her when she palled around with such women as Eleanor Roosevelt, Alice Paul, and Lady Astor. Jessie was one of the major players in the Equal Rights Amendment and minimum wage law for women. In 1920, she was instrumental in giving you, me, and all women the right to vote. My grandfather took Jessie to London when he was assigned to the American Embassy, where she met George Bernard Shaw. Shaw was so impressed with Jessie that he invited her to lecture with him throughout London. My mother was born during those years in England, right about the time Jessie and Hugh were presented at the court of St. James, where Jessie procured the only compliment given by the Queen that day for her dress. A gown that, unbeknownst to everyone present, she had purchased used at a consignment store. I followed my grandmother around and watched her from the back of the podium when she was 93 years old. She made several speeches in Hollywood with Gloria Steinem, Marlo Thomas, and Jane Fonda. Susan B. Anthony didn't know that she had given a young girl hope and purpose, which she in turn gave to me, a legacy of courage and hope and possibility with each vote I make.
Thank you, Mila. I am so grateful to get to hear about Jessie and some of her stories. I'm looking forward to learning more about the inspiring people who courageously champion the rights of women, including the untold experiences of women of color and other marginalized persons.
You gotta do when the Spirit says do. You gotta do when the Spirit says do. When the Spirit says do, you gotta do. Oh Lord, you gotta do when the Spirit says do. 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 You gotta write when the Spirit says write. You gotta write when the Spirit says write. When the Spirit says write, you gotta write. Oh Lord, you gotta write when the Spirit says write. 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 You gotta vote when the Spirit says vote. You gotta vote when the Spirit says vote. When the Spirit says vote, you gotta vote. Oh Lord, you gotta vote when the Spirit says vote. 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 You gotta shout when the Spirit says shout. You gotta shout when the Spirit says shout. When the Spirit says shout, you gotta shout. Oh Lord, you gotta shout when the Spirit says shout. 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 You gotta do when the Spirit says do. You gotta do when the Spirit says do. When the Spirit says do, you gotta do. Oh Lord, you gotta do when the Spirit says do. 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 Spirit says do.
You may have heard that in July, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez denounced the verbal abuse she had been subjected to by colleague Representative Ted Yoho. Rather than dismiss it, Ocasio-Cortez exposed his behavior and subsequent apology by speaking about it on the House floor. She said, "I could not allow my nieces, I could not allow the little girls I go home to, I could not allow victims of verbal abuse and worse to see that, and to see our Congress accept it as legitimate, and to accept it as an apology, and to accept silence as a form of acceptance," she said. "I could not allow that to stand." After Ocasio-Cortez spoke, Representative Pramila Jayapal pointed out on the House floor that between 1915 and 1930, the use of the B word in books more than doubled. This occurred in tandem with the popularization of the women's suffrage movement and the subsequent ratification of the 19th Amendment. Hell hath no fury like a man who has to share the ballot box. And so we see that the work is far from done. Courageous and prophetic voices continue to ring out. How will you join yours with theirs?
Although we're about to extinguish our various chalices in our various homes, we can carry the sense of connection, sense of joy, fullness, the challenge, sense of community, sense of hope, sense of connection with us into our day, into our week. I invite you to remember the time together, even in this way, as you move into your week. And together, let us carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. So may it be.